The letter fell out of the saddlebag like a secret that had been waiting too long to be told. Jacob Archer stood frozen in the middle of the livery stable in Dust Creek, Nevada, the year 1878, with the folded paper open in his hands and his chest carved hollow by every single word he was reading. He had not meant to open it. He had not meant to read it at all. The saddlebag belonged to Virginia Ellsworth, the quiet schoolteacher who rented the room above the general store, and he had only grabbed the wrong bag by accident when old Pete Calloway had hung two leather pouches on the same peg near the stable door. Jacob had reached in to find his own papers, the land deed he needed to file at the courthouse before noon, and instead his fingers had closed around a folded envelope, sealed and addressed in a handwriting so precise and deliberate it seemed to carry its own kind of heartbreak. He had not meant to open it, but the seal was already broken, and the paper had slipped free before he could stop it, and the first line had hit him like a fist before he could look away. I am writing this letter because I will not survive what is coming, and someone deserves to know the truth before I am gone. That was the line that stopped him cold. He stood there with the Nevada dust drifting through the open stable door, and the horses shifting in their stalls, and he read every single word. And then, because his mind refused to believe it the first time, because the implications were so enormous and so terrifying and so unbearably sad, he read every word again. Virginia Ellsworth was in danger, not the ordinary kind of danger that women in frontier towns faced every day, the kind you could manage with a locked door or a trusted neighbor. This was the specific, deliberate, targeted kind of danger that came from a man named Silas Rourke, a land speculator from Carson City who had followed her here, who had been watching her, who had made promises that were actually threats dressed up in the language of courtship. Jacob Archer knew the name Silas Rourke. Every person in Dust Creek with any sense knew that name and felt the cold weight of it. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and stood there for exactly 3 seconds making a decision that would change the entire course of his life. Then he walked out of the livery stable into the blinding Nevada morning and went to find Virginia Ellsworth. He had to go back further than that to explain everything. He had to go back to the beginning, to 6 weeks earlier, to the afternoon Virginia Ellsworth had first arrived in Dust Creek on the afternoon stage from Reno. Jacob had been standing outside the sheriff's office talking with Marshal Ben Hatch about a stolen horse when the stage had rattled in from the eastern road. He had not been paying particular attention. Women arrived in Dust Creek from time to time, some of them wives coming to join husbands who had staked mining claims, some of them running from something they did not wish to name out loud, and some of them, rarely, with the kind of purposeful determination that suggested they had made a careful plan and intended to carry it out regardless of what the territory threw at them. Virginia Ellsworth had stepped down from that stagecoach with exactly that kind of determination. She was 26 years old, which he would only learn later, and she carried a leather trunk and a satchel of books, and she wore a dark green traveling dress that was practical rather than pretty, though Jacob would have argued it was both. She had dark auburn hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and her eyes, even from across the street, had a quality he could not immediately name. It was not hardness exactly. It was more like a person who had learned to be very careful about what they allowed other people to see. Marshal Hatch had said, "That's the new school teacher. Town council hired her out of a letter she sent from Sacramento." Jacob had said, "Is that right?" in the way a man says something when he is pretending not to be interested while in fact being entirely, completely, mortifyingly interested. He had found reasons to walk past the schoolhouse every single day for the first 2 weeks. He told himself he was just being a responsible member of the community. He was 31 years old, a rancher with 400 acres of good grazing land to the north of town, a man who had built something real and solid out of nothing, and he had absolutely no business finding excuses to walk past a schoolhouse like he was 17 years old with a fresh sunburn and a hopeless case of feelings. But then she had come into the hardware store while he was buying fence wire, and she had asked old Clarence Bubb whether he stocked any chalk, and Jacob had turned around and they had made eye contact for the first time at close range, and something in his chest had shifted in a way that felt both terrifying and extraordinarily right. She had looked at him the way she looked at everything, with that careful, measured quality, like she was calculating exactly how much trust was appropriate to extend. He had said, "Jacob Archer, I've got the ranch north of town." She had said, "Virginia Ellsworth, I'm teaching the children." And that had been their entire first conversation, but it had taken up an enormous amount of space in Jacob's mind for the next several days. He had learned about her in pieces, the way you learn about a person in a small town where information travels on the wind and through coffee cups and across fence lines. She had grown up in Ohio. She had trained as a teacher in Columbus. She had spent 3 years teaching in Sacramento before she had applied for the Dust Creek position. She was unmarried. She was private. She kept a small vegetable garden on the south side of the building where she lived. She read by lamplight until very late most nights, because Jacob had noticed the light in her window on the evenings when he had reason to ride through town after dark, which he admitted to himself was more evenings than was strictly necessary. The town had its opinions about Virginia Ellsworth, as small towns always do. Most of them were respectful. She was a good teacher, rigorous and patient at once, which is the rarest and most valuable combination. The children liked her even when they pretended not to, which is the truest measure of a good teacher. The mothers in town trusted her. The fathers in town respected her. The only person in Dust Creek who made Jacob uneasy in relation to Virginia was Silas Rourke, and Rourke had not even arrived until 3 weeks after Virginia had. Silas Rourke came to Dust Creek in October of 1878 on the pretense of investigating mining claims and land opportunities in the area. He was 42 years old, well-dressed in the style of a man who wanted you to know he had money, with a silver watch chain and boots that had never seen trail dust. He was charming in the specific, calculated way that made the back of Jacob's neck prickle, the way a snake is beautiful right up until the moment it strikes. Rourke had immediately made his interest in Virginia Ellsworth known, and not subtly. He had sent flowers to the schoolhouse. He had appeared at the general store on multiple occasions when Virginia was shopping. He had engineered introductions through mutual acquaintances with the smooth efficiency of a man who was used to arranging things to his advantage. Virginia had been polite and completely unrevealing in response to all of it, and Jacob, watching from his careful sideline distance, had recognized the particular quality of her politeness toward Rourke. It was armor. It was the kind of controlled, surface-level courtesy that a woman uses when she is frightened but cannot afford to let the frightening thing know she is frightened. He had wanted to ask her about it directly. He had found himself rehearsing conversations in his head while he was mending fence or riding the north pasture. He had wanted to say, "Are you all right? Do you need anything? That man makes me uneasy, and I think he makes you uneasy too, and I would very much like to help you if there is any help you need." But there was no natural opening for that kind of conversation, and Virginia Ellsworth was not the kind of woman who would respond well to a man inserting himself uninvited into what she might consider her private business. So he had waited. He had been patient, and he had watched from a respectful distance, and he had found other ways to be useful, fixing a loose board on the schoolhouse steps one morning when he happened to notice it, bringing an extra cord of wood to the general store's back entrance with a note that said it was a donation from his ranch for the school's use. He had not signed the note with his name, and Virginia had not asked anyone who had sent it, though he suspected she knew anyway. And then he had picked up the wrong saddlebag and read her letter twice, and everything changed. He found her at the schoolhouse at 9:30 in the morning, after the children had come in and she had gotten them settled with their readers. He knocked on the open door and she looked up from where she was writing on the chalkboard, and something in his expression must have told her immediately that something was wrong, because she set the chalk down very carefully and walked to the door. "Mr. Archer," she said in that measured voice. "What is it?" He held out the letter and he watched the color leave her face. She looked at the letter, and then she looked at him, and her jaw set in a way that was equal parts humiliation and fury, the expression of a woman who has been keeping a secret and has just discovered that the secret has decided to reveal itself on its own terms, without her permission. "I picked up the wrong saddlebag at Pete Calloway's stable this morning," he said. "The seal was already broken. I did not read it on purpose, but I read it. I am sorry for that, but I am not sorry that I know what it says." She stepped out of the doorway and pulled the door mostly shut behind her so the children could not hear. "How much did you read?" she asked, and her voice was so controlled it was almost frightening. "All of it," he said, "twice." She looked at him for a long moment with those careful, measuring eyes, and he held her gaze because he wanted her to see that he was not afraid of what the letter contained, and that he was not going to use it against her, and that whatever was in that letter was not going to change his opinion of her in any direction except the one that made him want to help her more than he already did. "It was written to my sister," she said finally, "in Columbus. I gathered that. I have not sent it yet." "I gathered that too." She reached out and took the letter from his hand and stood there holding it, and he noticed that her fingers were not quite steady, which was the only outward sign she gave of how frightened she truly was. "Silas Rourke is not what he appears to be," she said. "I imagine you have worked that out." "Tell me the rest," Jacob said. "Tell me all of it, because the letter mentions things it doesn't fully explain, and I need to understand what I am dealing with before I can figure out how to help you." She looked at him again with that careful measuring quality, and this time he got the impression that whatever calculation she was running in her head came out in his favor, because she said, "Can you come back at noon, when the children break for their midday meal?" "I'll be here," he said. He spent the next 2.5 hours in a state of controlled, deliberate usefulness, doing the things he had come to town to do, filing the land deed at the courthouse, speaking with Marshal Hatch briefly about nothing in particular, buying the supplies he needed, but underneath all of it his mind was running hard and fast on what he had read in Virginia Ellsworth's letter. The letter had told her sister, whose name was Clara, that Virginia had not arrived in Dusk Creek by coincidence. She had chosen Dusk Creek specifically because it was small and remote and far from Carson City, where she had previously lived for 8 months before Sacramento. She had lived in Carson City because she had been briefly engaged to a man named Silas Rourke. She had broken that engagement when she had discovered, through careful and frightening investigation, that Rourke was not a legitimate land speculator at all, but a man who was involved in a systematic fraud involving falsified mining claims, bribed officials, and the deliberate ruination of small landowners who stood between him and the properties he wanted. She had broken the engagement. She had tried to report what she knew to the authorities in Carson City, but Rourke had connections there that went deep and wide, and she had been told very clearly, by someone she believed, that if she pursued the matter she would be in serious danger. So she had left Carson City. She had gone back to Sacramento. She had applied for the teaching position in Dusk Creek under the reasonable assumption that Rourke would not bother to follow a schoolteacher to a small mining town in the Nevada desert. She had been wrong. The letter to her sister said that Rourke had arrived in Dusk Creek approximately 3 weeks after Virginia herself had, which was too precise to be coincidence and too targeted to be anything other than what it was. He had someone following her movements. He had known where she was going before she got there. And he had come to Dusk Creek not to court her, as he pretended, but to silence her, because she was the only person who had both the knowledge and the courage to expose what he was doing. The letter also said something else, something that had hit Jacob with the force of a physical blow when he had read it the first time, and which had stayed with him through the second reading, and was still sitting in the center of his chest like a stone. She had written, "I am afraid that I have also developed feelings for a man here, which is the worst possible timing in the world, and which I mention only because it seems important to be honest with you about all of it while I still can. His name is Jacob Archer, and he is a rancher, and he is a good man, which I have determined through careful observation, and I am telling you this only because I would not want to be in danger, and have you not know about the good things as well as the frightening ones. I do not believe he has any particular feeling for me. I have not given him reason to. Jacob had read that paragraph twice too. He returned to the schoolhouse at noon exactly, carrying 2 wrapped sandwiches he had bought from the hotel dining room, because it seemed like the kind of thing that might be useful, and because he needed something to do with his hands. Virginia was sitting on the schoolhouse steps with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked up when he arrived, and he held out one of the wrapped sandwiches, and she took it, which he counted as a small victory of trust. They sat on the steps together, and she told him the full story, not just what was in the letter but all the parts around it, the details she had left out because she could not bring herself to put them on paper even in a letter to her sister. She told him about the night in Carson City when she had come home to find her room searched, everything displaced by just enough to tell her someone had been there without meaning to leave any evidence. She told him about the man she had seen watching her from across the street in Sacramento 3 days before she had boarded the stage for Nevada. She told him about the way Rourke looked at her here in Dusk Creek, with a smile that said he owned something and she was it. She told all of this in a steady, controlled voice, and Jacob listened to all of it without interrupting. And when she was done, he sat for a moment with the weight of it, and then he said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at him with slight surprise, as though she had been expecting him to tell her what to do rather than to ask. "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean exactly what I said. This is your situation. You have lived with it longer than I have, and you have thought about it more than I have. You know work better than I do. So what do you want to do about it?" The slight surprise softened into something more complicated, something that was close to relief but also touched with sadness, as though being asked rather than told was something she was not used to and was therefore both comforting and slightly painful. "I want evidence," she said. "The kind that cannot be dismissed. The kind that cannot be made to disappear by men in Carson City who are on his payroll. I want to expose what he is doing completely enough that he cannot continue to do it and cannot come after me for having done it, because the exposure is already complete and coming after me afterward would only confirm what I have already revealed." "That's a dangerous game," Jacob said. "Getting that evidence means getting close enough to him to find it." "I know," she said. "He has men with him. 2 of them," she said. "I have noticed them. They stay at the hotel. He is not going to give you access to whatever he is carrying without reason." "He thinks he is courting me," Virginia said, and something in her voice was bleak and practical at once. "He believes I am being gradually won over. He believes that because I am polite to him, I am becoming amenable. He has a considerable amount of confidence in his own ability to charm women." Jacob felt something cold and very precise settle in his chest, a feeling that was not jealousy exactly, but was in the same family as jealousy, mixed with a protective fury that had no clean outlet. "I do not think you should put yourself in any more proximity to that man than you already have," he said, and he kept his voice as neutral as he could manage. "I may not have a choice," she said. "You have a choice," he said. "You have choices you may not have considered yet. But I need you to consider them before you do anything that puts you in direct reach of Rourke or his men." She looked at him with those careful eyes, and he held her gaze again, and this time the calculation he saw her running was longer and more complicated, and when it resolved into something that was neither the careful politeness nor the controlled armor. It was something quieter and more genuine, something that looked like the beginning of actual trust. "All right," she said. "I am listening." What Jacob had in mind required 3 things: time, allies, and the kind of patience that went against every instinct he currently possessed. The first ally was Marshal Ben Hatch, who was not a corrupt man. Jacob knew this because he had known Ben Hatch for 6 years, and had seen him operate in situations where corruption would have been the easier path, and Hatch had always taken the harder path instead. He brought Hatch into the matter the following morning, presenting it carefully, laying out what Virginia had told him in a sequence that was clear and organized and well supported. Hatch listened with his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed, and when Jacob was done he said, "Rourke has been making noise to the county commissioner about land rights in the valley north of here. I thought it was legitimate business. It did not smell right to me, but I could not have told you why. This explains the smell. Virginia has documentation," Jacob said. "Letters Rourke wrote her when they were engaged in Carson City. She kept them because she had the instinct even then that they might be important. They reference transactions by name and by location that can be cross-referenced against the official claim records." Hatch said, "I need to see those letters." Virginia, who Jacob had brought to this meeting against her initial reluctance, reached into her satchel and produced a small bundle of letters tied with a dark ribbon. She set them on Hatch's desk and removed her hand and stepped back, and the gesture had in it something of the quality of a person putting down a very heavy weight they have been carrying for a long time. Hatch read for 20 minutes in complete silence. Then he said, "This woman needs to be somewhere that is not directly accessible to Rourke and his men." "The ranch," Jacob said, and Virginia turned to look at him quickly. "Mr. Archer," she began. "It is the safest location in 30 miles, he said. "I have good men working for me, men I trust. It is defensible. It is away from town where Rourke has eyes everywhere. And your being there has a reasonable explanation if anyone asks, because I have been looking to hire someone to help organize the ranch records, and that is something a schoolteacher could reasonably do in the off-season." Virginia looked at him, and he could see her working through the implications, the practical ones and the social ones, and he said, "There is a separate room in the main house that has a lock on the door. My housekeeper, Rosa Medina, lives there with her family. You would be well chaperoned and you would be safe. Those are the only things that matter to me right now." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "It is not a permanent solution." "No," he agreed. "The permanent solution is getting Rourke arrested and prosecuted in a jurisdiction where he does not have influence, which is what we are going to work toward. But you cannot work toward anything if you are in danger, and right now you are in danger." She looked at him for a long moment and he thought he saw, very briefly, the careful measured expression crack just slightly at the edges, not in the direction of tears but in the direction of something more complicated, something that looked like a woman who had been managing everything alone for a long time and had just been offered, for the first time, a genuine hand. "All right," she said, for the second time in 2 days. And this time it carried in it something more like surrender, the good kind, the kind that means trust. Moving Virginia from the room above the general store to Jacob's ranch required a reason that would not alert Rourke, and the reason they gave the town, which spread naturally through the networks of conversation that kept small towns running, was that Virginia had been offered additional income helping to organize the Archer Ranch's accounts and correspondence during the school's brief November recess. It was plausible, it was ordinary, and it gave Virginia a reason to pack her trunk and her book satchel and move without anyone, including Rourke's 2 watching men, having particular reason to find it suspicious. The day she arrived at the ranch, Jacob showed her to the room that Rosa Medina had prepared, a comfortable room on the east side of the house with a window that faced the valley and a good lock on the door, as promised. Rosa, who was a compact and efficient woman in her late 40s with no tolerance for nonsense of any kind, had looked at Virginia Ellsworth with the specific sharp assessment of a woman who knows how to read a situation, and had apparently found Virginia satisfactory because she had said, "I will bring dinner at 6. The bolt on that door works from the inside and you should use it." Virginia had said, "Thank you, Mrs. Medina," and Rosa had said, "Rosa," in a tone that was as close to warmth as Rosa typically managed. Jacob had shown Virginia the workspace he had cleared for her, a large table in the ranch office with access to the records and account books he had described as her reason for being there. He had done this not as pretense but as genuine offer, because his accounts actually were in considerable disorder, and he thought the order might help. But they had also, sitting at that table that first evening after dinner while the fire burned in the ranch house hearth, begun to plan in earnest. The central problem was evidence. Virginia had her bundle of letters, and those letters were suggestive but not conclusive. What they needed was documentation of the current fraud, the specific, ongoing operation that Rourke was running out of the Nevada territory. They knew from what Rourke had said during his visits in town that he was in communication with several mine claim holders in the valley north of Dust Creek, men who were being pressured to sell their claims at below-market rates under the suggestion that the claims were less valuable than the owners believed. Rourke was the one telling them the claims were weak. He had a man, a false asser by the name of Clement Webb, who was producing fraudulent reports. And he had someone inside the Territorial Land Office in Carson City who was altering records after transactions completed. Jacob knew two of the mine claim holders personally. He went to see them the next day, riding out to their claims in the foothills east of town, and he had conversations that were careful and indirect, but which confirmed what Virginia had described. Both men had been visited by Rourke. Both had been given Clement Webb's fraudulent assessments. Both were worried. One of them had already signed preliminary papers. Jacob said, "Don't complete that transaction yet. Give me 2 weeks." The man looked at him with the distrust of someone who has already been maneuvered once and is not eager to be maneuvered again, and Jacob said, "I am not asking you to trust me blindly. I am asking you to wait 2 weeks before you sign anything final. If I cannot give you a good reason to wait by then, you can do whatever you judge best." The man said he would wait. The other claim holder had not yet signed anything and was relieved at the suggestion that he hold off. Jacob came back to the ranch in the late afternoon and found Virginia at the table in the office, surrounded by his account books, which she had, without anyone asking her to, begun to organize. She had a systematic method, clear and logical, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her work, the way she moved from one column to the next with the same focused precision she brought to everything, and he felt that shifting feeling in his chest again, stronger this time. She looked up and he gave her his report from the claim holders, and she listened carefully and asked precise questions, and then she said, "Clement Webb is the key. Rourke can claim ignorance of the assay results if it comes to it. But if Webb can be shown to be falsifying reports, and if we can tie Webb directly to Rourke in a way that cannot be explained away, that is a case that will hold up." "Webb is staying at the hotel in town," Jacob said. "He has been there for a week and a half. He is supposed to be conducting independent assessments, but he is not actually visiting the claims. I know because Bill Tanner at the livery told me Webb has not hired a horse since he arrived." Virginia's eyes sharpened. "An asser who is not going to the claims. An asser who is writing reports in his hotel room," Jacob said. "Can we get those reports?" "Not without going through his room," Jacob said. "Which is neither legal nor straightforward." "Then we need him to bring them out of his room voluntarily," Virginia said. She was quiet for a moment, thinking, and Jacob watched her think. "He will need to deliver them to Rourke eventually. When he does, if the transfer can be witnessed by someone credible, that establishes the connection." "Marshal Hatch is credible," Jacob said. "Yes, but Hatch cannot simply stand outside Rourke's door hoping for a delivery. He needs a reason to be there." They thought about this together for a while, the fire crackling, the Nevada night settling cold and absolute outside the windows, and Jacob found himself thinking that there was something extraordinary about sitting in this room with this woman, working through a problem together, the two of them thinking in a way that was parallel and complementary rather than competing, each catching the things the other missed. It was Virginia who found the solution, and it was characteristically simple and direct. She said, "Rourke wants to meet with me. He has asked 3 times now to have dinner with me. I have been politely delaying. What if I accept?" At the hotel dining room, which is a public space. What if I accept for an evening that we choose, and Hatch is there at a nearby table with legitimate reason, and you are there as well? If Rourke is planning to receive the reports from Webb during that period, he may delay the delivery to avoid the public setting, Jacob said. Or he may not, Virginia said. Men like Rourke believe they are untouchable. They conduct business openly because they have always been protected from consequences. He may receive the delivery openly precisely because he does not believe there is any risk. Jacob looked at her. And if he realizes what you are doing, then I am in danger regardless, she said, with a calm that was more frightening than any panic would have been. The difference is whether I am in danger and we have evidence or in danger and we do not. He wanted to argue against this. Every protective instinct he possessed was aligned against it. But he also recognized that she was right, and that her right to make this decision about her own situation was not something he was willing to override. Then we set it up carefully, he said. And you do not go anywhere near Rourke without a plan that has exits built into it. She looked at him with something that was almost a smile, not the surface politeness she deployed in public, but something smaller and more real, a flicker of genuine warmth that came and went so quickly he might have doubted he had seen it, except that he was paying very close attention. You are remarkably easy to plan with, Mr. Archer, she said. Jacob, he said. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, Jacob. And the way she said his name was quiet and considered, the way she said everything, but he felt it from his collarbone to his boot heels. The next 5 days were a careful construction. Virginia sent word through the proper social channels that she would be pleased to join Mr. Rourke for dinner at the hotel on the coming Friday evening. Marshal Hatch made arrangements to dine at the hotel that same evening, citing entirely fabricated reasons that were nonetheless convincing. Jacob had a frank conversation with the hotel owner, a man named George Pratt, who had his own reasons to want Rourke's influence out of Dusk Creek, and Pratt agreed to ensure that the seating arrangement placed Hatch's table within clear sightline of wherever Rourke was seated. Meanwhile, Jacob had also sent a letter to a friend in Carson City, a man named Thomas Reed who worked as a clerk at the territorial courthouse and who had mentioned, years ago, noticing discrepancies in some land transfer records. He wrote carefully, giving Reed enough information to prompt a search without endangering the man unnecessarily. The reply came on Thursday, and it was everything Jacob had hoped for and more, because Reed had found 3 separate land transfers in the past 2 years that showed clear evidence of post-transaction alteration, and he had quietly made certified copies of the originals from the date stamps before they were changed. Thomas Reed was going to be a crucial witness, and Jacob needed to protect him as much as he needed to protect Virginia. He wrote back immediately, telling Reed to make additional copies and place them with a trusted person who was not connected to the courthouse. Friday arrived with the cold clarity of a November morning in the Nevada desert, the sky a hard, perfect blue above the brown hills, and Virginia came out of the ranch house in the early light wearing a deep blue dress that was clearly her best, reserved for occasions that required it. Jacob was in the yard with his foreman, a quiet, steady man named Luis Delgado, and when Virginia walked out, he had to consciously keep his expression from doing something embarrassing. She had done her hair differently, down from the severe practical pins she wore for teaching, arranged instead in a way that was elegant and deliberately appealing, the exact look of a woman who was trying to appear as though she was trying to look her best for a man she was warming to. It was strategic. He knew it was strategic, and knowing it was strategic did not make the slightest difference to his response. She caught him looking and she said, in a voice pitched low so only he could hear, "Armor takes different forms." "You look," he said, and then stopped and started again. "You look very capable of handling Silas Rourke." The corner of her mouth moved. "That is a kind way of putting it." He rode her into town in the wagon at 6:45, and before she got down from the seat he said, quietly, Hatch will be at the table to your left when you walk in. I will be at the bar. If anything feels wrong, any instinct at all, you get up and you walk to Hatch's table. You do not wait to see if the instinct is right. You just go." She looked at him, and the careful exterior was thinner tonight than usual, or perhaps he was better at reading it now. She said, "And if nothing goes wrong, then we have a very dull evening and try again," he said. And then, because he could not say it, he said, "Be careful, please." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said, "I will," and climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the hotel with her back straight and her chin level. And Jacob watched her go and prayed to whatever was listening that this would work. It worked. Not in the way they had planned exactly, because nothing in field operations ever goes precisely as planned, but in the essential ways, the ways that mattered. Rourke was at his usual corner table, dressed expensively, the silver watch chain catching the lamp light, and he stood when Virginia entered with every appearance of genuine delight, which was the most unsettling thing about him, Jacob thought from his position at the bar, the way the performance of warmth was so fluent and convincing. You had to know it was a performance to see through it. The dinner proceeded. Hatch was at his table to the left. Jacob nursed a single glass of water at the bar and watched without appearing to watch. 40 minutes into the dinner, Clement Webb came through the back door of the hotel dining room. He was a thin man with a nervous quality, eyes that moved too quickly, and he was carrying a leather document case. He went directly to Rourke's table and leaned down to speak quietly. Rourke's eyes flickered with irritation at the interruption, then with something more calculated, and he accepted the case under the table with a smoothness that would have been invisible to anyone not watching for exactly this. Webb left. Rourke set the document case beside his chair and continued his dinner with Virginia, who had not given the slightest outward indication of having noticed anything. But Hatch had seen it. Jacob had seen it. And George Pratt, who was moving quietly through the dining room refilling water glasses in an entirely natural way, had also seen it. When dinner ended and Rourke escorted Virginia to the hotel's front door, in a gesture of proprietorial courtesy that made Jacob's hands tighten around his glass, Hatch moved. He approached Rourke before Rourke could re-enter the hotel, with a deputy at his side and a warrant that he had obtained from the local judge 2 days earlier, on the strength of Thomas Reed's documented evidence from Carson City. Rourke looked at the warrant with that smooth, dangerous smile and said, "Marshal, I assure you there has been a misunderstanding." Hatch said, "You can assure me of that at the jailhouse." What happened next took approximately 4 minutes and involved Rourke's 2 men appearing from somewhere, and a brief and extremely tense standoff in front of the hotel, which resolved when Luis Delgado and 2 other ranch hands who Jacob had stationed in the street stepped out of the shadows, and Rourke's men looked at the numbers and made a practical calculation. Rourke went to the jailhouse. His men went with him. Virginia was standing on the boardwalk in front of the hotel, her hands clasped in front of her, and Jacob crossed the street to where she was standing, and she looked at him and exhaled a very long breath that contained in it weeks and months and possibly years of held tension, and he said, "It's done," and she said, "Not entirely," because she was too precise a person to accept a victory before it was actually complete. "No," he agreed, "not entirely, but started." She looked up at him in the lamplight, and her expression was utterly unguarded in a way he had never seen before, stripped of the careful armor, not because she had chosen to remove it, but because the relief was too large for the armor to contain. She looked, for just this moment, exactly as frightened and exhausted and relieved as she actually was, and he did not think before he did what he did next, which was to reach out and take her hand in both of his. She looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him, and she did not pull away. "You are going to be all right," he said. "I am going to make sure of it." She said quietly, "I know," and the fact that she said it, the fact that she believed it and said so directly, was the most significant thing she had ever said to him. The legal process that followed was neither quick nor simple, which is the true nature of justice in the territory, whatever the dime novels might suggest. Rourke's Carson City connections attempted to intervene, as expected, but Thomas Reed's certified copies from the courthouse arrived by express rider the following week, and the documentation was too thorough and too clearly handled for the intervention to hold. A federal marshal came up from Carson City to take charge of the case, a man named Whitfield who had no local entanglements and who reviewed the evidence with the dispassionate efficiency of someone who has seen this pattern before in other forms. Rourke was held in the Dust Creek jailhouse for 12 days while the federal process organized itself, and during those 12 days Dust Creek was a town on edge, aware that something significant was happening but not fully certain of the outcome, which is always the most uncomfortable kind of uncertainty. Virginia returned to teaching, because she was Virginia and the children needed their teacher, and because standing still during a period of waiting was not something she was constitutionally capable of. She stayed at the ranch in the evenings, because there was still Rourke's network to consider, and she continued working on Jacob's accounts, which were by now in considerably better order, organized into a system that was clear enough for anyone to follow. Jacob found reasons to be near the schoolhouse during the day. He told himself this was a security precaution. He also told himself, more honestly, that it was nothing of the sort, and that the reasons he was finding to ride past the schoolhouse in the mid-morning, or to happen to be at the general store when Virginia was there after school, were not security reasons at all. One evening, 10 days into the waiting period, he came into the ranch office to find her sitting at the table not with his account books, but with a piece of paper she was writing on herself. She looked up when he came in, and there was a brief moment where she considered whether to cover what she was writing, and then she decided against it, which told him something. "Another letter to your sister?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "A different one than the last. Is it better news?" She looked down at the paper and then back up at him. "A great deal better," she said. "I am telling her about this place, about the people here, about how the desert looks in the morning, which I did not expect to be as beautiful as it is." A pause, and then, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has chosen to say something they might otherwise not have, "I am telling her about you." Jacob stood very still. "What are you telling her?" Virginia looked at him directly, which was the only way she ever looked at anyone. "That you are the person who found my letter and read it twice. That without that accident I do not know what would have happened to me. That you are a good man. That I have become, over the course of these past weeks, rather more than grateful." Another pause. "That I am not certain what to do about that, because I came here alone on purpose and have always been more comfortable alone. But that I am not sure comfortable is precisely what I want anymore." The fire in the hearth made small sounds. The Nevada night pressed cold and enormous against the windows. Jacob sat down in the chair across the table from her and said, "What do you want?" She smiled then, a real one, not the small flicker he had seen before, but a full and genuine smile that changed her entire face, that made her look younger and less guarded and extraordinarily beautiful, and she said, "I'm still working that out. I thought you should know the direction of the working." "I appreciate knowing the direction," he said. "For what it's worth, I have been working out something similar." "I know," she said. "I noticed. Was I that obvious?" "You brought me sandwiches," she said, "and split wood for the school. And you made sure Rosa Medina chaperoned me correctly so no one could say anything unkind. And you asked what I wanted instead of telling me. And you held my hand outside the hotel, and it was the kindest thing anyone has done for me in years." The smile did not diminish. "You were not subtle, Jacob." "I was trying to be respectful," he said. "You were," she said. "That is not the same as subtle. I appreciated both." He looked at her across the table and said, "Virginia, when this is finished, when Rourke is properly dealt with and you are safe and everything has settled, I would very much like to court you. Properly. With all the tedious conventions intact. Because I think you deserve the conventions, and I would enjoy the excuse to spend the time they require." She looked at him for a long moment with those careful, intelligent eyes, and then she said, "I think I would like that." The federal process completed itself 14 days after that conversation, which Jacob would later think of as one of the longest 14 days of his life, not because they were unpleasant, but because they were in a state of suspension between the promise of something and the actual thing itself, which is its own particular form of exquisite discomfort. Silas Rourke was transferred to Carson City under federal escort and formally charged with land fraud, falsification of official documents, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to defraud. The charges were thorough and well supported, and the federal marshal, Whitfield, had indicated clearly that he expected conviction. The two mine claim holders who had been pressured received the news with visible relief. Clement Webb, faced with the full weight of the evidence, cooperated with the federal investigation and provided detailed testimony about Rourke's operations that extended well beyond Dust Creek, confirming that Virginia's instinct about the scale of the fraud had been entirely accurate. Thomas Reed in Carson City received a letter of commendation from the federal marshal's office and a quiet, cautious measure of professional protection, which was the best Jacob could arrange for him, and which Reed had accepted with the exhausted gratitude of someone who had been carrying a secret he could not be sure was safe. On the evening after Whitfield and his men rode south with Rourke in custody, Virginia came out onto the ranch house porch where Jacob was standing watching the stars come out over the desert, which in Nevada is an event of such visual grandeur that it is nearly impossible to take for granted, no matter how many times you have seen it. She stood beside him and they were both quiet for a while, and then she said, "It's over." "Yes," he said. "I have not had a moment in 2 years when I could say that." He turned to look at her profile against the darkening sky, and she was still looking at the stars, her expression open and unguarded in the way it had been in front of the hotel, but calmer now, more settled, as though the relief had had time to become something more permanent. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Continue teaching," she said, without hesitation. "The children need a teacher, and I have found that I am very attached to this particular group of children. And I thought," she turned to look at him then, "that you mentioned something about the tedious conventions of courtship." "I did," he said. "I would like to begin them," she said, "if the offer still stands." He looked at her in the starlight and said, "Virginia, the offer will stand as long as I do." She smiled at him, and the smile had in it everything she had been too careful to say out loud, all the warmth that had been behind the armor all along, and he thought that he was very grateful for a wrong saddlebag and a letter with a broken seal, and the accident that had made him read every word twice. The courtship that followed was everything Jacob had promised and everything Virginia had privately hoped for, though she would not have admitted the hoping to anyone except her sister Clara, to whom she was now writing regularly, and with considerably more lightness than the letter Jacob had read in the stable. He called on her properly, arriving at the schoolhouse on Saturday afternoons when the children were gone and the week's work was finished, bringing small things that were practical or beautiful, once a set of colored chalks she had mentioned finding useful, once a book of poetry that he had ordered specially from the bookseller in Sacramento, and which arrived after 6 weeks with his card inside. Once simply himself with 2 horses saddled, and a suggestion that she might like to see the north pasture of the ranch in the late autumn light, which she did. They talked about everything. This was the thing Jacob had not anticipated, the sheer breadth of what they could discuss: history and agriculture and literature, and law and the children in her classroom, and the management of ranch land and the political situation in the territory, and what they each believed about the way the world ought to work. She had opinions that were strongly held and carefully considered, and she did not soften them for the sake of agreeableness, which Jacob found entirely and unexpectedly wonderful, because he did not want a woman who agreed with him. He wanted a woman who made him think, and Virginia Ellsworth made him think harder than he had thought in years. She was also funny, which he had suspected from a few brief glimpses of dry wit during their crisis period, but which revealed itself fully in the relaxed space of courtship. She had a precise, quiet humor that operated largely through understatement and timing, and Jacob had a wider, warmer sense of humor that operated through absurdity and observation, and they fit together in this as in most things, each one's approach complementing rather than competing with the others. Rosa Medina watched all of this with the expression of a woman who knew perfectly well what was happening and approved of it, and was not going to say so directly, but was going to convey it through cooking elaborate dinners on the evenings Virginia stayed late, and through ensuring that the oil lamp in the parlor was always freshly filled. December came, and then the new year of 1879, and Dust Creek settled into the winter rhythms of a small, high-desert town, slow and cold and close-knit, the kind of winter that draws people together by sheer physical necessity and keeps them together by the warmth of having shared it. Virginia's schoolroom became a gathering place on Friday evenings, when she organized a reading circle for the adults of the town that met to discuss books and read aloud and argue about ideas, and Jacob came every week and sat at one of the children's desks that was entirely too small for him, and listened to her read with the same focused attention that the children brought to their lessons. He proposed to her in January. He did it at the ranch, in the office where they had first planned against Rourke, at the table where she had told him she was writing about him in her letter to Clara. He did not make a production of it, because he knew Virginia well enough by then to know that productions made her uncomfortable, and that directness was what she valued and what she trusted. He said, "Virginia, I would like to marry you. I am asking you plainly because I think you prefer plain asking to elaborate staging, and because what I feel for you is not something I am capable of expressing in elaborate staging anyway. I love you. I have loved you since about the third week after you arrived, though I did not say so because I was being respectful of your privacy. I am a man who has land and a house and good people around me and a capacity for deep loyalty, and I would spend the rest of my life making you glad you stayed in Dust Creek." Virginia looked at him for a moment with the expression she had when she was processing something significant, and then she said, "Jacob Archer, I love you also. I loved you before I wrote about you in that letter. I did not think it would be returned, which was the assumption I had built as a shield. You demolished that shield very thoroughly. Was that all right?" he asked. "It was the best thing that has happened to me in my life," she said, simply and directly, the way she said everything. "Yes, the answer is yes." They were married in April of 1879, in the Dust Creek Church, which was a plain wooden building with clear glass windows that showed the Nevada desert in full spring color, which in the high desert means the gray-green of sage and the bright particular gold of the early season wildflowers and the enormous sky. The ceremony was attended by most of the town, because Virginia had become in her months in Dust Creek a person that people were genuinely fond of rather than merely respectful of, and because Jacob was a man the town had trusted for years. Clara Ellsworth came from Columbus for the wedding, traveling by train and then by stage, and she arrived 2 days before the ceremony and stood on the porch of the ranch house with her sister, and held both Virginia's hands and looked at the man who had picked up a letter by accident and read it twice. And then she looked back at Virginia with the expression of a sister who is simply, uncomplicated, wholly glad. Rosa Medina cooked for 3 days in advance of the wedding, and managed the entire domestic production of the event with the efficiency of a military campaign, and Luis Delgado stood with Jacob at the front of the church with the expression of a man who was genuinely happy for his employer, and also personally relieved that Jacob Archer had finally done something decisive about the situation he had been making obvious to everyone at the ranch for months. Marshal Ben Hatch attended and shook Jacob's hand afterward and said, "I always thought you had good judgment about most things. Took you a while to apply it properly here." Jacob said, "Thank you, Ben," with the dignity of a man accepting a compliment that contains a gentle insult. Virginia overheard this exchange and smiled her real smile, the full one, the one that had taken months to earn the regular sight of, and Jacob saw her smiling and forgot entirely what Hatch had just said to him. They had a wedding supper at the ranch that lasted until nearly midnight, with a fiddle player Jacob had hired from the next town over who turned out to be genuinely excellent, and dancing on the cleared floor of the barn that Jacob had swept and hung with paper lanterns, and the kind of laughter that happens when a group of people who have been through something difficult together find themselves on the other side of it with reason to celebrate. Virginia danced with Jacob 3 times and with Marshall Hatch once, and with Louis Delgado once, and with George Pratt from the hotel, who turned out to be an unexpectedly graceful dancer for a man of his build. And then she came back to Jacob and stood beside him watching the other couples dance and leaned her head slightly against his shoulder in a gesture so small and natural, and trusting that he had to close his eyes for a moment. He said, "How are you?" She said, "Happy," with such simple directness that it rang like a bell. The first year of their marriage had the quality of something being discovered rather than something being built, because most of what they were to each other had been established already in the months of crisis and courtship. And what marriage added was the depth of daily life, the morning rhythms and the evening conversations and the shared decisions, and the small continuous accumulation of knowing another person in all the ordinary ways that are more intimate than any extraordinary moment. Virginia continued teaching. Jacob had assumed, or rather hoped, but not assumed, because he knew better than to assume anything about Virginia Ellsworth's plans, that she would continue teaching, and she did. The Dust Creek School Board had no objection. Married women who taught were not common but not unheard of in the territory, and Virginia had made herself indispensable in the way that genuinely excellent teachers do, so that the question of replacement was essentially unthinkable. She organized her classroom and her household with equal precision, and managed both without apparent strain, which impressed Jacob enormously, not because he had doubted her capacity, but because witnessing competence at close range is always impressive regardless of expectation. She had a schedule and it worked. She had a system for everything and the systems worked. And she had a deep, quiet joy in the work of both the classroom and the household that came through in the quality of her attention to each. Jacob expanded the ranch in the spring of 1879, purchasing the adjacent 400 acres that had come available when one of the neighboring ranchers decided to move his family to California. This made the Archer Ranch a significant holding by territorial standards, and the additional land required more hands and more organization and more careful planning. And Virginia, who had finished reorganizing Jacob's original accounts to a state of perfection sometime in the winter, found in the expansion a new and genuinely interesting administrative challenge. They spent evenings that first spring at the big table in the office, which had become their default shared workspace, with the accounts and maps spread between them and the lamp burning and the coffee growing cold, while they discussed grazing rotation and water rights and the management of the additional pasture. And these evenings were among Jacob's favorites of the many good things in his life. Not because the content was exciting, but because the experience of solving problems together with someone who thought clearly and argued honestly and laughed when something was funny was a very particular and very profound pleasure. Clara wrote regularly from Columbus, and Virginia wrote back with equal regularity, and Jacob occasionally found himself reading these letters over Virginia's shoulder, not as an invasion of privacy, but because Virginia had acquired the habit of reading him the interesting parts, which had gradually expanded to most of the letter, and which he had come to look forward to as a kind of window into the Ohio world his wife had come from, and the sister who was still there. Clara had her own life, a position teaching at a school in Columbus, an apartment she had described with affection, a circle of friends, and the particular contentment of a person who had chosen her life deliberately and was living it with intention. She had written, after the wedding, a letter that Virginia had read entirely to Jacob, which contained the sentence, "He sounds like precisely the right kind of person," which is to say someone who asks you what you want and then listens to your actual answer, and then helps you get there. Those men exist in smaller numbers than they should. Jacob had found this assessment both accurate and humbling in equal measure. The news from Carson City, when it came in pieces over the course of the year. Silas Rourke had been tried and convicted on the primary fraud charges in the summer of 1879. His man at the Territorial Land Office had also been charged and convicted. Clement Webb's testimony had been central to the prosecution and had been thorough enough that 3 additional associates of Rourke's operation had been implicated. The total scope of the fraud, as it was revealed through the federal investigation, was larger than even Virginia had estimated, spanning 4 counties and involving over a dozen fraudulent claim transfers. The news was satisfying in the way that proper resolution of injustice is satisfying, which is to say deeply and cleanly, without any ambiguity. Virginia read the final letter from Marshal Whitfield summarizing the convictions and sat for a long moment with it in her hands, and Jacob watched her face as she processed it, saw the emotions cross it in sequence, relief and vindication, and the particular sadness that comes from being proven right about something you had wished you were wrong about. Then she folded the letter carefully and set it down and looked at Jacob and said, "It's done, properly done this time." "Yes," he said. "I did not know if it would be," she said. "I believed it could be, but there was always the possibility that it would not be." "I know," he said. She stood up from the table and came around to where he was sitting and put her arms around him, and held on in the way that meant something very specific, the way she held on when she needed to be in contact with something real and solid and known. He held her back with the same intention, and they stayed that way for a while with the Nevada afternoon pressing golden through the office windows. Virginia discovered she was expecting a child in October of 1879, which she reported to Jacob with the same directness she brought to all significant information, looking at him with the careful measuring eyes and saying, "I need to tell you something," and then telling him. Jacob's response was not words, at least not immediately. His response was to stand up from where he had been sitting and reach for her hands and hold them and look at her with an expression that she told Clara in her next letter was the most genuinely delighted thing she had ever seen on a human face. He said eventually, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Is there anything you need?" "I need everything to remain as it is," she said, "because everything as it is exactly what I need." Rosa Medina, when informed, organized the spare bedroom adjacent to the main bedroom into a nursery with the efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for this development and has had the plans ready for some time. She did not say this. She did not need to. The winter of 1879 and 1880 was the most contented period of Jacob Archer's life to date, and he was aware of this while he was living it, which is not always the case with the best periods of one's life. He was aware of the quality of the mornings, Virginia at the breakfast table with her hair not yet pinned up for the day, and a cup of coffee, and the day's considerations already organized in her mind, ready to be discussed. He was aware of the quality of the evenings, the fire and the lamp and the books they read, sometimes aloud to each other, sometimes in parallel silence. He was aware of the way the ranch had become, in the 2 years since he had built the main house, something it had not quite been before, which was a home in the full sense of the word, a place shaped by 2 people's lives rather than one. Virginia taught until the end of February of 1880, when the practical considerations of her condition made the daily walk to the schoolhouse and the management of 30 active children more demanding than she felt appropriate to the circumstances. The school board arranged a substitute, a retired teacher from Austin who was visiting family in Dust Creek and who agreed to finish the school year, and Virginia handed over her classroom with the organized thoroughness of someone who has left everything in order for the person following her. She did not find the waiting comfortable. She was not, by nature, a person who waited well, and the weeks of February and March and into April when she was at the ranch and not teaching were filled with the ranch accounts, and with reading and with correspondence, and with the production of an extremely comprehensive set of planning documents for her eventual return to the classroom that the substitute teacher found both extraordinarily helpful and slightly intimidating. Their son was born on the 14th of April, 1880, with Rosa Medina in attendance and the doctor from Dust Creek present. And the birth was difficult in the ordinary way that births are difficult but uncomplicated in the ways that matter most. And when it was over and the baby was placed in Virginia's arms, she looked down at him with the expression of someone encountering a thing that has exceeded all prior understanding. Jacob was in the room by then, having been kept in the hall for the significant portion of the proceedings as was the custom, and he came to the bedside and looked at his wife and his son, and felt something that had no adequate word in English or any other language he knew, something that was made of love and gratitude and awe and terror, and the kind of happiness that is so complete it sits right alongside grief, because you know immediately that you would not survive losing it. Virginia looked up from the baby and at Jacob, and he saw the same thing on her face that he felt, the enormity of it, the overwhelming specific rightness of this moment, this life. "He looks like you," she said. Jacob looked at the baby, who was red-faced and emphatic and appeared to be primarily interested in registering his views about the world loudly. "You are being kind," he said. "I am never kind when I could be accurate," she said, which was true, and he laughed, which was not the most controlled response he had ever had but was entirely appropriate. They named him William Henry Archer, William for Jacob's grandfather and Henry for Virginia's father, and he was called Will from the first day. Will Archer was, from the beginning, a child who had inherited his mother's precision and his father's warmth in a combination that suggested a very interesting future person. He was observant and patient in the way that was his mother, and he was sociable and warm in the way that was his father, and he had something that seemed to be entirely his own, which was an absolute fascination with animals from the earliest age, so that before he could walk, he was already crawling toward the ranch dogs with a focused intensity that made everyone around him laugh. Virginia returned to teaching in September of 1880, with Will at the age of 5 months in the care of Rosa Medina during school hours, an arrangement that Rosa had proposed before Virginia could raise the subject, because Rosa had been managing the ranch household long enough to know exactly how Virginia would spend her leave time, and exactly how she would feel about not being in her classroom in September. The school year of 1880 to 1881 was Virginia's best year of teaching by her own assessment, because she had in her classroom a group of children who had been with her for 2 years now, and who had developed the kind of trust in her that good students develop in good teachers, the kind that produces genuine intellectual risk-taking and real conversation, and the rare and wonderful thing of a classroom that thinks together. Jacob expanded the ranch's cattle operation in 1881, adding a second herd with a more complex grazing rotation, and Virginia's account management expanded with it. They had developed, without particularly planning to, a working partnership in the ranch's administration that was efficient and complementary, and that they both found genuinely enjoyable. Louis Delgado had told Jacob, with the blunt assessment that long employment permits, "She is better at the books than you were." "I know," Jacob had said. "You should pay her for it." "She is my wife," Jacob said. "That is not the same as paying her for it," Delgado had said, with the expression of a man who has said his piece and intends to let it stand. Jacob had thought about this and then discussed it with Virginia directly, who had looked at him with an expression of mild surprise and said, "That is a very equitable instinct." And then they had arranged a formal structure for her management of the ranch accounts that was recognized on paper, which was the right thing, and which Jacob was glad Delgado had prompted him toward. Clara came to visit in the summer of 1881 for 6 weeks and met Will, who was 14 months old by then and mobile and opinionated and deeply charming in the way of children who have been given consistent love and clear boundaries. Clara sat on the ranch house porch with her nephew in her lap and her sister beside her, and the Nevada summer pressing golden and enormous all around them, and said, "This is not what I pictured when you wrote me that first letter." Virginia said, "What did you picture?" "Something more like survival," Clara said. "What you have here is considerably more than survival." Virginia looked out at the valley, at the land that Jacob had built and that she was now also a builder of, and at Will, who was attempting with great seriousness to convince Aunt Clara to let him down so he could investigate the family dog, and said, "Yes, it is." Clara asked her that visit, "Do you ever think about going back to Ohio?" Virginia considered this genuinely, which was the only way she considered anything. "No," she said. "I came here running from something which was not what I wanted. What happened instead was that I arrived somewhere. That is different. You do not leave the place you have arrived." Clara smiled at her sister and said, "No, I do not suppose you do." There was a second pregnancy in 1882. Virginia told Jacob at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in February, with the same directness she had the first time, and Jacob's response was, if anything, even more delighted than the first, which she told Clara in her letter that week was both slightly ridiculous and entirely wonderful. This child, a daughter, was born in September of 1882, healthy and emphatic from the first moment, with Virginia's auburn hair and Jacob's dark eyes, a combination that resulted in a child of striking appearance and, it would become clear, considerable force of personality. They named her Eleanor Ruth Archer. Eleanor for no one in particular, but because Virginia had always liked the sound of it, and Ruth for Rosa Medina's mother, which was Jacob's idea, and which made Rosa cry, quietly and without acknowledgement, in the kitchen for approximately 10 minutes before she emerged composed and organized dinner with her usual efficiency. Will was 2 years and 5 months when Eleanor was born, and he regarded his sister with the solemn assessment of a small person confronting an enormous fact. And then he sat down next to where Rosa had placed her in her basket and decided he was her guardian, which was a role he carried with remarkable consistency for a child his age. Jacob, watching his son watch his daughter on a quiet October afternoon, thought that whatever life had asked of him, everything he had built and worked for and worried about and hoped for, this was the return on all of it, this specific and unrepeatable life. Virginia found him in this moment of reflection and stood beside him watching their children and said, "You have that expression again." "What expression?" "The one that means you are thinking something very large and have no words for it." "That is a precise description," he said. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they stood together watching Will carefully introduce his sister to the ranch cat, who was tolerating this with the long-suffering patience of a cat that has been part of a family long enough to have developed opinions about it. "Jacob," she said. "Yes, I have been thinking about the letter." He looked down at her. "Which letter?" She glanced up at him with the small, real smile. "The one you found." "Ah," he said, "that letter." "I have been thinking," she said, "that accidents are an interesting thing. Because if Pete Calloway had hung our saddlebags on different pegs, or if the seal had not been broken, or if you had simply handed the bag back without looking inside, then none of this would have happened, and I would have done something drastic and possibly very dangerous on my own, and Rourke might have won, and I would certainly not be standing here right now." "No," Jacob agreed. "I used to be a person who believed in very careful planning," she said. "I had everything arranged and considered. I had exit routes and contingencies. I was entirely prepared to manage my life on my own terms without assistance from anyone." "You were," he said. "And then a man picked up my letter by accident and read it twice," she said. "And it turned out that my plans were not actually sufficient, and that the thing I needed was not another exit route but a person to stand with. He looked at her, this woman who had arrived in Dust Creek with her leather trunk and her satchel of books and her careful eyes and her armor that had taken months to earn through, and he thought about the letter, every word of it, the terrifying parts and the part about the good man named Jacob Archer that she had not expected to encounter and had not expected to survive the telling of. "I am very glad I read it," he said. "So am I," she said. "Thoroughly, entirely, every single day." He kissed the top of her head, and she made a small sound of contentment, and they stood together on the ranch house porch in the Nevada afternoon with their children nearby, and the valley spreading out below them and the sky enormous overhead, and there was nothing left unresolved, nothing held in fear or held back in caution, nothing that the future needed to apologize for. Whatever had been lost before this had been real loss. Virginia's years of fear and isolation were real. Jacob's years of building alone were real. Neither of them pretended otherwise, because pretending was not something either of them did well or valued in the other. But they were here now, on this side of all of it, and this side was so thoroughly and specifically good that it contained within it even the difficult parts, the way a clear day contains the memory of rain. The years that followed in Dust Creek were good years, the kind that build a life so fully that you can look back from any point in them and see the structure clearly, solid and well-made and genuinely theirs. Will Archer grew into a boy who was as comfortable on horseback as he was in his mother's classroom, which Virginia ran with the same rigorous warmth for another decade, becoming the kind of institution in a town that people mean when they say a place has quality. Eleanor Archer grew into a girl who had her father's warmth and her mother's precision, and a determination that exceeded both, and who at the age of 6 had opinions about the management of the ranch that were not entirely without merit. Jacob expanded the ranch twice more before 1890, each time in careful consultation with Virginia over the account books that she managed with the same systematic clarity she had brought to everything from the beginning. Luis Delgado stayed, and his family became part of the extended family of the ranch, and Rosa Medina stayed, and Will grew old enough to help with real work and took to it with the natural ease of someone who loves what they do. Clara visited every 2 years and wrote in between and was the thread that kept Virginia connected to the Ohio world she had come from. And through those letters and those visits Virginia remained herself in the complete sense. Not only the woman she had become in Nevada, but the woman she had always been before it, the connection visible and maintained and genuinely cherished. Marshall Ben Hatch retired in 1884 and was replaced by a younger man who was also good, and Dust Creek grew through the decade, adding a second store and a bank and a larger church and a better hotel, and eventually a proper telegraph line. And all of it happened around the steady, reliable core of Jacob Archer's ranch and Virginia Ellsworth Archer's school, which were the kind of institutions that gave a town its spine. They had their third child in 1886, a boy named Thomas Edward Archer, Thomas for Thomas Reed in Carson City, who had helped them at considerable personal risk, and who was told, in a letter from both Jacob and Virginia, about the namesake, and who wrote back a reply that Virginia read to Jacob at the breakfast table on a Thursday morning, and which made them both quiet for a moment in the way that very good things do. Thomas Edward Archer was born in April, and was from the beginning a calmer and more philosophical child than his siblings, observant and content in the way of a child, who has found the world sufficient without requiring it to be dramatic. Will, who was 5 years old when Thomas arrived, took his guardian role and extended it immediately. Eleanor, who was 3.5, regarded her new brother with the expression of someone who has been presented with an interesting problem and is formulating a theory. Jacob, watching his 3 children in the lamplight of the ranch house parlor one winter evening in 1887, thought that there was a particular quality to the life he was living that he did not have words for and had never encountered before, and that he was fairly certain was simply happiness, the sustained, unremarkable, deeply rooted kind that is not an event but a condition, not something that happens to you but something you inhabit. Virginia was reading to the children, a chapter from a book she had chosen with her usual precision, and she was using her teaching voice, the one that made stories larger than themselves, and Will was leaning forward in his chair and Alina was sitting very straight with the expression of someone processing, and Thomas was asleep against Virginia's side in the unself-conscious way of the youngest child, and the fire made its small sounds, and the Nevada night pressed cold and beautiful against the windows. Jacob was not reading, he was watching. He had been watching Virginia Ellsworth for 9 years by then, with the same attention he had brought to her on the day she had stepped off the stage coach in Dusk Creek with her leather trunk and her satchel of books, and she was still the most interesting person in any room she occupied, and she still had the capacity to stop his thinking midstream simply by looking at him in a particular way. She looked up from the book and across the room at him, because she always knew when he was watching. She had known from the very beginning, though she had not let on until considerably later, and she looked at him with the real smile, the full one, the one he had worked 6 weeks to earn the first time and which now appeared regularly and was still every time a specific gift. He thought of the letter. He thought of the words he had read twice in the stable, standing in the dust with the horses shifting in their stalls, and the Nevada morning bright outside the open door. He thought of the terrifying parts and the practical parts and the part that had hit him hardest, the part where she had written about a good man named Jacob Archer, and had said she did not believe he had any particular feeling for her, and had not given him reason to. He had wanted, every time he thought of that paragraph, to go back to that morning and find some way to tell her, the Virginia of that morning who was writing letters to her sister in case she did not survive, that she was spectacularly wrong about the particular feeling, that she had given him reason and then some, that every fence he had ridden past, and every piece of wood he had left with a note, and every question he had asked instead of told had been saturated with the particular feeling from the beginning. He was glad he had not been able to go back and tell her. He was glad it had happened the way it had happened, in the slow, careful, earned way of two people who neither of them trusted quickly, but who had found in each other something that made trust feel like the only reasonable response to everything. He was glad for the wrong saddlebag and the broken seal, and every word read twice. Virginia was still looking at him from across the room with the real smile, and Will was tugging at her sleeve asking what happened next, and Thomas was asleep against her side, and Alina was formulating her theory, and the fire burned and the Nevada night was beautiful and enormous outside, and Jacob Archer thought, with the simplest and most complete certainty of his life, that everything had arrived exactly where it was supposed to be. "What happens next?" Virginia said to Will with her teaching voice. "I don't know," Will said. "That is why I am asking. Take your best guess," she said, "and then we will find out if you are right." This was what she always said in the classroom, and Will made his best guess with the confidence of a child who has been taught that guessing carefully is the beginning of knowing. And then Virginia turned the page and read on, and Jacob sat with his family in the lamplight and the warmth, and the night outside was full of stars, and there was nothing left to be afraid of, and everything worth having had already been given. And the story that had started with an accident in a livery stable in 1878 was settled and complete and good, and it continued, day after day, in the best possible way.